Hey, welcome to another week of the Aaron Running Podcast. We got another guest today, and this time we are going to have on Mr. Honest Youth Pastor, or known also by Michael.
Yep.
Is it Michael Moore?
Yes. Yeah. Michael
Yeah.
Moore. Yep.
Okay. Right on. And so maybe just to start off, how about you just tell us a little bit about yourself? I think are you a youth pastor?
I was a youth pastor. Yes. So when we started this account, that's where the Honest Youth Pastor came from. So I guess a little backstory, just so everybody kind of understands that part of it. That would be important. Back 10 years ago now, a little over 10 years ago, started the account because I was transitioning out of a youth pastor position at a church. That's a much longer story to get into that we won't get into currently, but transition out of a youth pastor position. It was a really rough transition. Needed to vent about what was going on within just the church in general, but my specific situation. And so a lot of people don't know that the Honest Youth Pastor really started as like this just way for me to vent anonymously online. And it's transformed obviously into something more than that now, but that's where it started at. So currently, I'm more what you would probably classify as more of an assistant pastor within my church. I'm not on staff, but I operate in that capacity in regards to preaching once a month, helping out on Wednesday night during Bible studies, doing things like that around the church. I do our youth pastor that we have now. I basically just advise him, help him any way I can in regard to bouncing ideas off and things like that, just because I used to be a youth pastor. So that's why the name is there, because when we started, I was, and then it just sort of stuck as we go along the way. But my name is Michael. So just to give you a little bit more about my story, other than just that part of it, grew up in church my whole life. Did the stuff that probably a lot of people would kind of know about and probably experience themselves as well, as far as just grew up in the church, went to youth camps, did all that thing. Depending on what denomination or what youth camps you went to, you're familiar with the, like, I got saved every year or maybe every night of youth camp, depending on what camp you went to. And during probably junior, senior year, one of those 2 years, felt called to ministry in whatever way, which I just thought was strange because I'm an incredibly strong introvert. And I didn't think that was, I didn't know what to do with that, but I went with it, ran with it, went and got a degree in youth ministry from a place called Indiana Wesleyan University. I actually was dating at the time my wife, what lady that eventually turns to my wife. We both go there, graduate, come back, assist in different capacities that the churches were at, and then eventually become the youth pastor at that church. And then that transition happens to where this account sort of opened up and we went to a different church and all the other sort of stuff. But basic 90s, early 2000 sort of background in church that seems to be a fairly relatable thing to most people in that regard. And then so here we are now in 2024, making memes and talking about random things about theology.
Yeah, and your YouTube channel is I've watched quite a few of the videos actually, and I think you've covered like sermons, right? You do like
Weekly sermon reviews. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, or sermon reviews, and then you've also done like I forget what you would call them, like making of a minister.
Yeah, just the
Yeah.
backgrounds. I think I've done 4 of those, working on the 5th one now, just kind of looking at either typically well-known pastors. I think we did one of somebody that most people just kind of know from online, but yeah, just looking at kind of how they got to the theology they got to and why they operate the way they do. Yep.
Yeah, I saw the one that you did on Isaiah Saldivar, and it's kind of funny because I was living in Stockton at that like
Okay.
around the same time
Cool.
that he started his ministry. And
Yeah.
his like I think it's his little sister. I don't know if it's older. I know it's his sister was actually coming to my small group for a bit, and that's how I actually originally heard about
Wow.
him. Yeah,
Small
and
world. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and I was like, wait, he did a whole like thing on Isaiah, like it's kind of funny, but
Yeah, it was very
yeah,
interesting. His was, and then he reacted to it too, which he never. No shade on Isaiah, I suppose, in this regard, but like he never, like I DM'd him, he never got me back, and then he reacts to the video. I was like, all right, well, at least I know what you think about it, at least, even though you didn't,
yeah.
message me back. But yeah, that was interesting because nobody else has done that, so that was pretty cool.
Well, I appreciate the videos. I appreciated like the Andy Stanley one too. Really, really good. So, but yeah,
Thank you.
I think we just met on Twitter, right? I think I saw you like
Uh,
follow, and then
yeah, I
yeah,
think it was Twitter where you, I think, originally reached out. Yeah.
yeah, okay. And so I saw you tweeting about egalitarianism.
Mhm.
And I was like, I think that's a great topic I would want to cover on my channel. And I'm not sure if you covered it on your. I think I've seen a couple that you did cover.
I think I've touched on it. I've never. I don't know as if I've done a like in depth thing on it, but yeah, I've definitely touched on it.
Yeah, it was like a sermon review. I think I can't remember who the guy was, but
Oh yeah, I don't remember either, but yeah, his
yeah,
whole sermon was on it for sure. Yeah.
yeah. And so maybe just to get started, like, what is egalitarianism? Like the
Uh,
definition of it.
yeah, so egalitarianism within the church, because it varies, obviously, within the culture, it's a bit different. But within the church, egalitarianism is basically the sense that egalitarians, for the most part, would say that there's definitely a difference of in between men and women. There's no like, it's not that anything you can do, I can do better, sort of thing. It's not quite that. It's very much like there is a difference, but there's very much even amongst those differences there are some things can be interchangeable. So, for example, egalitarians with it, we're talking specifically about church structure, would be that women can, be in elder roles. That would be the most distinct one, probably be between the other views. But it's women can be pastors, women can hold any role in the church. Egalitarians, as far as the home go, it really depends on the egalitarian you talk to. Some egalitarians would say, uh, the roles at home are the husband is the head of the house and he sort of leads, but that's not, again, depending on what egalitarian you talk to, it really varies. But that is the classical. If you're looking definitionally, it would be the man is still the head of the house in the home. um the wife and the husband work together, but essentially he makes the decisions. And that kind of transfers over to the church. I think there's this confusion that egalitarians think that um women can just like lead in the church and they don't have, there's no submission or anything like that. Some egalitarians, the more conservative egalitarians you talk to, would still say that if a woman is being an elder within the church, she still needs to be in submission to her husband. Like he has to say, like, okay, as weird as it sounds, like you can do that. And so it's one of those things where there's still this weird sort of attempt of like sort of aligning scripture to where she's still submissive to her husband, but she can still be an elder. And so it's egalitarian, just like complementarianism, is sort of on a spectrum, depending on who you talk to and where they're at and sort of what denomination is dealing with it. But the general idea is that there are differences, but they're very minor in regards to role and things that people can sort of do in offices they can hold. So hopefully that's sort of a mushy definition, really, depending on who you talk to.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And I think one of the distinguishing things with egalitarianism as opposed to like complementarianism is that in egalitarian churches, you're going to see more like women that are lead pastors, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Like
that's the big difference.
yeah, because like complementarians, that comes from the idea or the word of like complement, right? Like there's
Mhm.
obviously difference between men and women, but they complement each other.
Yeah.
Soft complementarians will actually still have women pastors, but they're not going to be like lead pastors of churches. You only find that
Mhm.
egalitarian. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're currently in a denomination that you said is egalitarian, right?
Yes, the Wesleyans are very proudly egalitarian, in regards to, I mean, they'll like, for example, they'll boast like they were one of the first denominations to have women pastors. I mean, I think because you have to tracking the Wesleyan denomination, it's sort of Nazarene, sort of Methodist, so there's some sort of Pentecostal as well, holiness denomination. So yeah, within that sort of stream of thought, there were some of the first to have women pastors. So yes, Wesleyans definitely hold to an egalitarian position, which makes me sort of an oddball, being ordained in this denomination, but not necessarily holding that position.
Okay. So you would hold more to like a complementarian position then?
Yes, I would hold the complementarian position. Which the odd thing is they know this. At least my district does, but they're kind of just chill with it at this point for whatever reason. So
Okay. Right on. And so, yeah, I was a part of a group of churches that was more complementarian, but they allowed like women deacons, but not
mhm.
like women pastors, which I think is a little more common in that world. Then the last denomination that I was a part of, um, they would call themselves soft complementarian or leaning egalitarian because they had like women pastors, but they weren't like elders. I don't know. It's weird ecclesiology in my
Definitionally,
opinion.
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. Um, I've since been landing in a church now. Me and my family have been to more of a one that's like strict, like I don't know if you'd call it like hard complementarian or what. It's like no women pastors, no women
Mhm.
deacons, like yeah. So um so with egalitarians, let's see. The question that I had, um, like I said, like you'll have like women lead pastors. So do you think as a complementarian that women can preach from like the pulpit, like on a Sunday morning Lord's Day service?
I would say no. Now this is why, because like you said, it sort of gets a little murky there because you're going definitionally. I try to as much as possible, and I know it's weird within our modern kind of church age because everything gets a little fuzzy because you've got it made up titles like youth pastor as well, and
Yeah.
so it's just sort of it gets a little weird there. I would say no, just because I think on the Lord's Day during the service, the elders of the church are the ones that are supposed to be opening the word and preaching the word. I where I would sort of break this down, I don't know where it places me, to be quite honest with you. I think obviously women giving testimonies, women, talking about what the Lord is doing in their lives. All of these things are, I think, things that we see within the scriptures already happening within the service. It's just a matter of, again, because church structure that we see within the New Testament and even the early church is far different church structure than we have now. And we've sort of created ourselves this weird mess trying to define old terms in modern churches. And so it gets a little murky. But no, just to answer the short, I guess that's a long answer. Short answer, no, I don't think you can biblically have a woman preaching on the Lord's Day in the service.
Yeah, I've heard some of the arguments that are like, well, they're under the authority of the
Hmm.
elders or something like that, right? So like the
Yeah.
elders are guarding the doctrine, but the women are just like encouraging from the word, I guess, are like words they've used or like,
Yeah.
I've also heard of like there's differences between like preaching and teaching. Have you heard that one too?
Uh, yeah, most of the time, I think when that comes up, they are equating preaching to a. It's a weird crossover to like prophesying almost. They it's sort of a connection there. It's not like a teaching didactically from the word as much as it is like a declaration, and I think that's where they get that crossover to like a really loose definition of prophecy. I think at that point you're just kind of playing word games. It's one of those things where for example, in my church, even though I mean Wesleyans are egalitarian, we're a fairly conservative Wesleyan church. Not to say that they haven't invited a woman to speak at like a revival or anything like that before, because they have. But in general, like kind of what goes down in our church, we have a lot of times where people will get up and testify about what God's doing in their life. A lot of women do that, and I think that's where like, okay, we see this in the New Testament, this is biblical, this is fine. That's a huge difference between, I think preaching and teaching go together. I guess I ramble on a lot, but to get to answer your question, I think those things sort of go together. You're preaching simultaneously as you're teaching. I think there's more detailed teaching that can be done, but that's much more, I think, discipleship, either personally or in a smaller group, than it would be from what we see traditionally done from the pulpit um, on the Lord's Day. So
Okay. And are Wesleyans continuationists or
no.
okay.
Well, it's a loose. It's so they don't land anywhere. Just to be clear, like so, this is where Wesleyans are real squishy. So the discipline that they have, which is just our little denominational book, doesn't necessarily say no. It's just kind of like the Lord has done it before, and maybe He still does. Like they don't shut it down. And again, this is where it depends on the Wesleyan church you're in and where they're at, because some Wesleyan churches are like, "Nah, we're not doing that," and other ones, especially like 4 or 5 decades ago, you like Wesleyans were known for like running the aisles and like screaming. And so like it's got a weird history where they don't really come down hard on it. Um, but most in more conservative Wesleyan churches would not be continuationist at all. But again, there are Wesleyans that are. So it's a weird denomination in that regard, especially
Okay.
on the gifts of the tongue.
Okay. Yeah. And I was just wondering because you mentioned like prophecy and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I'm more in the reformed camp, but I would take the more view of a continuationist, which I read some of the old reformers and they were like I did a video on John Knox who had prophecies that came to pass. So,
Yeah.
I'm
Wesley, that's the thing. Wesley was sort of a continuationalist. And so it was it's weird because he after Wesley like kind of left the Church of England, it is weird because he doesn't really there are some things that he's really outspoken and solid on, and then there's some other things that there's some things he leans really kind of what would be considered more reformed on, and then there's some things that he leans a lot more what we would now consider more charismatic on. I think that's Wesley just honestly coming out of the Church of England and trying to figure out what he actually believed, and it sort of just sort of settles as it is because he talks of prophecy and things like that. So
okay. Yeah. I know we totally changed the subject. We're supposed to be on egalitarianism, but
it's
hey,
good.
yeah. So I think I was gonna ask this. Like, do you think that a lot of the ideas of like egalitarianism is more coming from like cultural pressure? Like, I watched Mike Winger's videos on the subject, and he
Mhm.
even said, when he first started studying this, it was more he wanted to be convinced, and he's like, maybe that's because of cultural pressure, but he came out the other side still a complementarian. Like,
Yeah, I think that when you look at when it starts coming about, so again, it's a little the earliest you can find probably denominations such as the Wesleyans or Nazarenes or Assemblies of God even having women pastors is really during more like the very beginning of the Second Great Awakening. You're looking at 1800s, essentially early 1800s. And so it comes about somewhat from the Second Great Awakening and sort of the chaos of all of that, and really the charismaticness of that, and the idea that well, God has poured out His Spirit again, and because of that, we now have these women that are doing these things and prophesying and having words and having and preaching. Before that, it's not that I would say that they'd be like that can't happen, but it was definitely like a doorway that opened up this idea that women could be pastors. I mean, you have Amy McPherson, that's very popular from the Second Great Awakening, that really is so well known for that, and that's why she was just sort of on the scene because she was very dynamic and very energetic and charismatic. And I don't know if it's so much cultural pressure, though I'm sure that was sort of an undertone that was sort of happening anyway. But it seems like the religious fervor that is sort of built up during that time sort of propels it, and you almost have like you would have in a lot of even now you would hear people maybe use this terminology like, well, do you want to stop the Spirit of God? Like, are you crushing this, are you trying to hold that back? And that seems to be sort of the tone as well, as far as I can tell. Again, I'm not an historian on that time, but just looking back at it, it seems to be this idea that like, well, do you want to be the one that prevents the Holy Spirit from using these people from doing this stuff? And so that sort of opens the doorway to people saying, well, look what God's doing, and maybe this isn't something I should, So, but before that, before the 1800s, you don't really have it so much. And so it does seem to be, at least within the Christian culture, something that comes about. And, you have obviously some pushback for it, but within particular denominations, they just go, well, this is just God moving then. And then it's just slowly picks up and catches on.
yeah, I think like in some of those like charismatic circles, it's been around for a really long time. Like I think
Hmm.
of like, Assemblies of God and stuff. They've always had like
Hmm.
women pastors.
Yep.
I was more talking about just as of like recent, I guess. Do you think it's more of a
Oh, got
cultural
it.
pressure thing? Like,
Yeah, I'd say recently, if you're talking about, I don't know, let's just go 70s on up. I mean, you have the sexual revolution and then everything that sort of creeps in there, especially, I mean, now, every time you hear anybody critiquing those, such as myself, that would say women shouldn't be elders, the line is always, it's 2024, man. Or way back when it was 2020, man. Like, it's always that line of like, haven't we progressed past it? And I'm like, well, I mean, culturally, I think there's a ton of pressure to to kind of get along with this idea that there's an equality. And if equality, what does equality mean then among sexes? Well, that means that she can do or he can do anything anybody else can do. And I would say there's a huge pressure on that, especially from, I mean, if you even look at the Southern Baptist Convention, you have messengers. Not that like every denomination is set up that way, but there's always somebody sent from churches to do the voting on the stuff that's brought up, and you're really relying on them not being influenced by the culture around them to vote one way or the other. And so, I mean, more recently, yeah, I say within the last 3, 4 decades, you have a lot of cultural pressure outside, especially from, the business world, just society in general, of this idea of the breakdown of like roles, not just within, society, but roles within the home. And then therefore, of course, that's going to, I think we would be very ignorant to think that doesn't cascade itself into the church as easily, because everyone is being trained either through media or HR departments or just their friends and family to be conditioned to think a certain way. And of course, that's going to it's going to have some sort of role within the church, because there's going to be somebody at least that's sitting in that church that, even if it's just one person, they're going to go, yeah, but, and then that sort of, if that isn't explained biblically, that just sort of, that's the seed that grows to people go, well, yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah, but why don't we do that? And if it hasn't been explained, then it just sort of, it's just a ball that keeps rolling.
Yeah. And I just don't see how, I guess, that pastors, teachers get past scripture that like blatantly says it, and I know this is kind of like the verse that everyone always brings up, but like First Timothy 2, literally says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. And that's like not a very culturally, I don't know, like no one wants to hear that scripture, but it does say it. I mean, Paul is pretty clear. And I've heard arguments that like, oh, well, this is because Timothy was pushing against the extreme feminism in that culture with like the Temple of Artemis or Diana or whatever. I just don't think that makes sense. I mean, right? Like,
yeah. So that is always the argument. Again, in that sermon review you mentioned, again, I can't remember the pastor's name, but his arguments that he made, and the reason that was such a good sermon to review on the topic is because he basically brings up every argument, every baseline argument that egalitarians would. The issue with that is that you're dealing with Paul, which is coming out of a Jewish background, which is basically, for the most part, porting over quite a few things from the synagogue into just the local ecclesia. I mean, he's just taking a lot of the same sort of things and then bringing them over. And then we see that even within, I think it's Tertullian, I believe, or Origen, one of the two in the early church. They basically write out like, this is how church services go. And a lot of it is very similar to how Jewish synagogues would work, obviously with a more reading of the New Testament and whatnot. But there's some things that obviously changed because of the resurrection of Jesus, but a lot of it is ported over. So to say that he's just fighting against an extreme feminism within Ephesus is sort of silly, because Paul, as someone that has come out of sort of that system, doesn't just throw that away. I mean, there's a lot of things that obviously change. There's obviously his entire idea of Gentiles. Thank the Lord, changes. But there's a lot of things that, as he sets up, it's almost systematized. It's very structured. I mean, when he writes to the Corinthians, it's like, guys, you are acting crazy. It's chaos. No one's going to understand what's going on. Like, there should be a structure. And we get that finer structure really laid out as far as leadership, as you said, in Titus and Timothy. And I think you can put forth those arguments, and they can be right up to a point. I've had this conversation before with other people. I'm not saying that he's not in some ways pushing back against some idolatry and some things that are happening in the temple, because I mean, of course, I mean, that's there. So it's probably is evident in the church, and he probably is at least addressing that. But to say that's all he's addressing neglects what he tells Titus, neglects what we see in other places when he does write to other churches like Corinth. And so the other verse that gets used a lot is the one, I believe it's in Galatians or Ephesians, where he says, neither male nor female, Greek nor Gentile, or Greek or Jew. And then that's always used as like this general sweeping of, see, like we're all the same. And again, this is an argument I've had, and like you said, I don't see how people miss it. Exegetically, within the context, it's very clear what he's talking about. It's not that there are no more roles. It's not that Greeks and Jews don't exist. They do exist. It's not that slaves and freemen don't exist. They do exist. It's not that male and female don't exist. They do clearly exist. It's that you can't say this makes you any closer or further away from Christ. We all have access to the Lord. But that verse gets used a lot to say, well, see, like there's no breakdown. There's no division, which falls apart really whenever you read Philemon, when he's like, okay, Onesimus, go back. You're still his slave. And Philemon, you're supposed to treat him like a brother, even though he is your slave. So there's still clearly a structural system set up. But because of Christ, his life lived, his death, and his resurrection, there's a change in how we then treat each other and how we operate amongst one another. So there is still distinction, but the distinction changes. And so I think, again, I can argue with people till I'm blue in the face, but it's the arguments that are used, I think, are fairly weak. Even if you go to Old Testament examples of Deborah or whoever, I mean, all of these fall short of what you would qualify as a local leader of the church. And I think that's what's lacking. That's, for me, coming out of an egalitarian denomination. I don't know if I'm sure the conversation was sort of heading that way, but what changed my mind, because I grew up in an egalitarian denomination, I've always been either a Methodist or a Wesleyan. A very short time as a Baptist, but I don't even remember that because I was a kid. But my entire life, I grew up with this idea that, of course, women can be pastors and do that. And then I went to a denominational university that taught that. I had ladies in my class that were training to be pastors right beside me. And I get out and I start, using the tools that I was given. And I go, I just don't see how the arguments you have work, even at like a high level, like a university level, that I mean, one of my professors that I had recently came out with like this huge, like his little book and a whole video course on women in ministry. And I just go, like, I don't, like, he's a smart guy and I don't claim to be more intelligent than him, but I go, like, the arguments you're using scripturally don't make sense. And I get why you want, like you talked about Mike Winger, I get why you would like want it. You would want it to be this way. Because again, we've grown up in a culture that makes it bad if it's not. But at the end of the day, like, I have to look at scripture and say, what does scripture tell me to do? And I think on that, and we may be going this direction too, but I think people have a wrong idea of what complementarians actually believe women can do. You say, well, I don't think you can be an elder. And that phrase, like, just makes it to where you think women can't do anything or they're not worth anything. And that's simply not true. But that's sort of what people hear when they hear that phrase.
Yeah. And, I've also heard this argument too, and just going back a little bit to like 1 Timothy 2, is that there is, the idea of this kind of like man being first, woman being second kind of thing as a result of the fall. And now that Jesus has redeemed us, now man and women have like an equal authority. Have you heard this one as well?
Yeah. It's always Jesus' resurrection reverses the curse, and therefore, because that's part of the curse.
Yeah. And I don't see that, because in that next verse, literally verse 13, he takes it back to, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. This is pre-fall. And then he goes
creation
into,
order.
Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. So yeah, the pre-fall, and then he gives the second argument that yes, it is also because of the fall. Yeah, I don't see how. I think there was a time in my life too where I was a little more pressured from the church I was a part of to like adopt a more egalitarian view, and I was like, I just can't get past what it says right there,
Yeah, well, and that's the same thing. I've been very, as open as I can, I guess. I mean, there's not like all the communication I've had with my denomination has been via e-forms on the computer, but I've been as honest as I can be to say, like, if this is the position that like is unavoidable, like if this takes away my whatever within the church, fine. Like, it's like, it's not that important to me. You can have it, because I think it's one of those, and I've said this before, it's a hill I'll die on, because I think it is that important as far as church structure and how the church should operate. So yeah, I think, like you said, the pressure part of it's like that has been felt a little bit like, well, if you don't do this, you're going to be kicked out. It's like, well, which way's the door, my man? Like, just point me the direction. And so I think there is a pressure for people to do that. I've known other people that have definitely been like, well, like, again, I work outside of the church. So there's no like income pressure or whatever. It's just kind of like whatever. But I know guys that have had that, like that's their how they support their family. And so if you don't like to that idea, then you've got to go somewhere else, even though that's one of maybe the only things they did actually disagree with. So yeah, there's definitely a cultural pressure for that. So
Yeah, for sure. And like you were saying too, love women. There's plenty of ways for women to serve the church. I have a daughter, I want her to serve the church when she gets older. But I mean, it's just clear in scripture. And I don't know how we get past that or how to just kind of like try to explain it away when it's very,
mhm.
very clear. I think also in the next chapter too, in chapter 3, I meant 2 like TO, but chapter 3, like the qualifications for an elder overseer, it's clearly reserved for a man. Like,
Mhm.
language in there like husband of one wife, like this isn't no like man meaning like mankind type thing, like
Yeah, well, yeah, all of the things that are set up there are, like you said, clearly that. And then you even have, because the argument, I was on a debate on the Bible Dingers channel about this subject, and one of the things that came up were, well, can women be deacons? And that language is, again, that's a little bit less clear, I think. But then I defer to most people's chagrin, because how dare I defer to the early church? But the early church seems to, for a little bit of time, be okay with women deacons, and then they do shut that idea down eventually. But that language is a little bit less clear. But yeah.
yeah, because the whole like their wives, like likewise the wives, or it
Yeah.
could also be women.
Hmm.
Even then though, it still says like likewise their women, like
Yeah, it's yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's where I'm not. Yeah, I haven't. I'm very firm here, and I'm still kind of looking over here, because I've got this. I'm trying to wrestle with why the early church allowed it for a little bit with that. But yeah.
yeah, yeah, for sure. All right. So I think just like a closing question that I want to ask you is how important is this topic? Because a lot of people are just like, it's a secondary issue,
Yeah.
nothing to divide over. Like, so what do you think?
I think so. I've stated this online too, because I've come to the position in which I don't think, and I always have to define this because of how, again, our terms are so weird currently. I don't think it's a secondary issue. For me, it's a primary one. It's not a salvific one, but it is a primary one. In regards to, I don't think egalitarians are necessary. Like, I don't think they're in open rebellion. I do think there's an obedience and understanding issue. As arrogant as that may sound, me saying that, I do think there's an obedience issue there, but I don't think it's a salvific thing. Um, for many people, I think if you, obviously, again, as James says, if you do something it's sin, it's still sin. And so I think maybe if you read over it and you're like, I just, my denomination holds to this though, even though I think it's this, I think at that point you do have to do some wrestling. But the reason it's primary for me is because we have Paul talking to Titus and Timothy and saying, hey, this is how, like, I left you there to set up this structure. This is how the church operate. These are the men and the qualifications they should have so that they can lead this church. And one of the reasons that they have to have these qualifications is so that, like, when people come in teaching false doctrine, they can shut that down. And they are men that people can trust because they're above board. They're trustworthy. They're not doing it for money. They're not doing it for clout. They're there because they love the Lord and they love the local church, and they're going to be able to counteract this false doctrine. And so it's not just be like, oh, they're dudes, so just put them in there because they're guys. No, it's like there's very specific reasons for why these guys are supposed to be there, and very specific qualifications that they're supposed to have so that they can operate in a way that they're supposed to make sure the church is safe and secure and healthy. And so that's why it's a primary thing for me. I think if you usurp that in a way that goes, well, yeah, but it's just like women can do that too. I'm not arguing that there's a lot of women that can't, counteract false doctrine. I think that's also one of the arguments. Like, well, everything that guy would be doing, a woman could do as well. And I go, fair, but that's not what we have in scripture. And so, just because, in that case, I would say he's already given you, like, if you have a woman that's able to do that, please put her in charge of teaching other women. And because she's in Titus, it's very clear, like she needs to be doing this so that these women that are coming up aren't idle. They're not gossipers. They're not wasting their time. Like they need to be theologically trained as well. And if you have a woman that's able to do that, utilize her in that regard. And so I think that that's why it's a primary thing for me. I mean, I guess the short answer is that because we have a church that needs protected, and really a structure that is built in a very beautiful way, and if followed produces incredible disciples for Jesus Christ that are able to uniquely disciple other people in ways that, for example, that maybe I can't very specifically disciple a woman because my brain doesn't work that way. But we have very strong theological women that can do that. And we have men that are qualified over the church to make sure all of these things are operating the way they're supposed to be, so that when false doctrine inevitably comes in the church, because it will, you have defenses up. Not only, again, he says, I think it's Jude, maybe it's I'm not sure where the verse is. I think it's Jude, where it says, we have false teachers coming in, and they're convincing these weak women that don't know about things that aren't true. And one of the reasons they're able to do that is because, again, in Titus, he says, hey, these older women are supposed to be training these younger ones up so that doesn't happen. And so whenever you don't have everything in place the way it's supposed to be in place, you're really setting yourself up for a theologically weak church that can't defend itself against false doctrine, and men that aren't there, and men that maybe aren't even qualified to be able to defend the local church at all. And so your walls are down in the name of equality, but it's just you're leaving the doors wide open for terrible things because you want to be nice, and not hurt anybody's feelings about, because they feel like they're supposed to do something.
Yeah, and it's like you're saying, I've noticed a lot of churches that compromise on this issue. And I know we always like to say there's not necessarily a slippery slope, but it kind of seems like there is,
Mm-hmm.
and they tend to go more progressive once this issue, once they compromise on this one.
Yeah.
You inevitably see them become more on like in a gray area when it comes to like LGBT people in the church and things like that, and it kind of all starts with this one issue, of
Yeah.
egalitarianism.
Well, and I
And
would
so,
say, yeah, I think it was a subtweet from somebody the other day when I pointed out that, like, I understand that it's a slippery slope argument, but that doesn't mean it's automatically false. And the reply was, well, they named off some, denominations that have had women pastors forever, and they go, these denominations haven't haven't gone that way. And my counterpoint is that, like, that doesn't but the only ones that have been egalitarian. And so I don't think there's a time frame you can put on it, as much as there is, like, if I'm looking statistically at churches that have failed, and kind of went over to false doctrine, I can say that all of these are egalitarian, that at least that have gone that way have all been egalitarian. Not that, again, that denominations that don't have their failings. Of course they do, but at that point it's usually something different than what you've named off. And so I don't think there's a time frame on it. The Wesleyan Church is very close to going the same direction as the Methodist Church has went. I can't speak for every area, but I know in mine there are pastors that have already started talking about, if it does go that way, then how do we prevent what the Methodist churches went through, which is having to buy their buildings to separate. And so to say, oh, like, it's not like a slippery slope, every pastor I've talked to is fully aware that, like, that could very easily happen to us. And so what do we do preventative measure wise to prevent that? And so I know nobody likes to say that, but logically, in the heads of pastors that are in egalitarian denominations that, again, wouldn't pinpoint egalitarian to be the reason that is happening, but are still aware that the shift is there because they've seen sister denominations go that route. And I think in many regards, it's either women pastors that lead them down that way, or unqualified, very feminized pastors that lead them down that way, that aren't under the qualifications that we see Paul lay out and that honestly have, as far as I could tell, very little backbone to tell anyone no when it comes to the things that they're actually supposed to say no to. So
Yeah, and just for my world too, I'm not like a pastor. I was in vocational ministry for a little bit there, but not currently in it. And I would say, like the PCUSA, you saw it with a lot of that. The women ministers there, the RCA, Reformed Church in America, started there, went down the slippery slope. And I think there's a couple like modern Reform denominations and churches that are starting to go that route too. And I think it's something to look out for.
mhm.
So, but I just want to say, man, thank you for coming on. Really good conversation. I think my audience will benefit from it. And where can people find you? You got your YouTube, right? Honest Youth Pastor.
Yeah. Yeah, if you just search Honest Youth Pastor, something will pop up. Probably the YouTube stuff usually pops up first. So yeah, if you just Google that, you'll find it.
Right on. I'll make sure to put that in the description. And yeah, man, just want to say thanks again for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me on and being patient so we could find a time to do it. It took a minute, but thank you.
Yeah, don't worry, man. God bless.